Hi everybody, my name is Steve Stevens. I'm the founder and chief architect of Intelligo Networks. And today I'm talking to you about open networking, specifically Cumulus networks. Now, you may not have ever heard of these guys. What these guys are is there's two parts to the open networking world. There's the hardware part and the software part, the operating system. So they're kind of like the VMware of the server world. They actually make the operating system that goes on. So what happened a long time ago, well, not that long ago, a bunch of people got together, ex-big vendor, ex-Cisco, and a few other things, and they created what was called ONIE. That's a bootloader. Now, a bootloader is something that sits on a switch, an open networking switch, and you can then, once it boots, it's like the BIOS of a PC. Boots up, you can install whatever operating system you need. Now, they took ONIE, they donated it to the ONE Foundation or whatever it was, and now a bunch of people create ONIE switches. So in the open networking world, we've got Dell, we've got Juniper's made their own version, HP and so forth. Now, what I'm here to talk about today is Cumulus networks though. Cumulus is a version of Linux. That's all. There's actually nothing very complicated about it. So it's just Linux. Now you might say, just Linux. We've been running Linux on servers for a long time to be able to do a variety of things. Yeah, not like this Linux. So what Cumulus did is take away the processing power that is normally punted straight to the CPU and the control plane and left it in the ASICs. So that way, the actual sheer volume of power that's needed to compute and crunch the data stays in hardware. Now, that's what obviously happens on most enterprise-grade equipment. Now, they took a version of Debian. They got switchd, which is what their heart of their little secret source is, and that offloads the queries back into the CPU, and that makes the switching equipment work absolutely beautifully. So you end up with things like this beautiful switch here. So this is the Cumulus logo, #TurtleLove, and what they've done is they've installed, you get a switch like this. So really, it looks like a switch, smells like a switch, but it's actually not a switch. It's actually really just a server. It's like any server that we've had for a long time that we've run networking on. VLANs, etc., etc., etc. It's just Linux. Just Linux kernel networking. It's not anything complicated. It's not something we haven't, a lot of people haven't run for many years. So I kind of feel weird about calling it a switch because they're not switches. They're actually servers. And you log into them, and it's Linux, and you've got daemons, and and you can do all your Linux kind of commands. Now, that's the problem though, because these switches are very cheap, sub 10k, for 48 ports of 10 gig and 640 gigs, 15 to 20 or whatever it might be for this switch here, which is an absolute Michelangelo artistic piece of work. This is Dell Z9100 ON. 32 multi-rate ports, full 100 gigs, 128 10 gigs on a single 1RU platform. Absolutely beautiful. So that's the hardware part, but you've got to drive it. So this actually running Cumulus, right? So this is actually a Linux server. You can actually install MySQL, web servers, firewall rules. You can install a BitTorrent server if you really want to, and a bunch of other stuff. Actually, I wonder if anyone set up a mail server to run on a Cumulus switch. So one of the weird things about this is its biggest problem, right, is that it is Linux. So the reason this is a problem is you've got two worlds. You've got the network engineers, who for a long time have done everything they can to avoid using Linux. And that's not everyone, a good 95+%. They just stick with their Cisco command line, Juniper command line, and everything else like that. They just do their networking protocols. Even though Cisco has had its own TCL programming language for like 10, 15 years, it was never in any exams, it was no requirements, and nobody ever learnt it. I had to a few years ago to do a couple of cool things, but almost no Cisco engineer, including up to the CCIE levels that I've worked with, I'll go, hey, do you use TCL? And they're like, no idea what you're talking about. In Juniper, even JNCIEs, very few of them start shell. No, very few of them even go to the Unix world. They just don't bother. Now that's been an issue because they haven't been forced to. I was actually told a Cisco guy recently, this is Cisco's fault that they didn't enforce people to do this because they were trying to get them to stay within their world. They didn't want them to learn these other things. Even the latest Cisco XE or XR, you can go to Unix and see the real behind the scenes. Now, that's where the problem is. Networking engineers aren't great at Linux. It doesn't conform to their operational way of thinking. Right? It's not the same. In a switch, most of the vendors, doesn't matter if it's in Cisco, Juniper, Brocade, Huawei, or others, show run or the equivalent. You show a command, you show a config file, and that's it. You can do a bit of debugging, and it's not that complicated. Linux, on the other hand, is a bit more complicated. We're in a situation where we've got a Linux file system. There's a lot of files, slash etc slash blah blah, right? A lot of places you can actually put configuration. That's okay. So what? We've separated out a few configuration files. Cisco had that a few years ago with VLAN databases being kept in a different place. But the biggest problem that Cisco has is, not Cisco, that Cumulus has, and being Linux, is that there is no comprehensive snapshot of what the configuration of a switch is. That's just the nature of Linux. You can go and look in some config files, but config files actually mean nothing. Right? The contents of a config file may resemble the truth of an actual loaded config, but it doesn't actually have to be. Because on a command line in Linux, we know this, right? You might have etc sysconfig for IP tables, and you can put your commands in, but you can just type on the command line IP tables blah. You can do ifconfig, you can change MTUs, bring interfaces up and down, you can do firewall rules, you can do all these things in the command line, and that configuration exists nowhere. That's the number one scary thing for Linux for network engineers. It's known to the Linux engineers. I'm on RHCE, Red Hat. So I in-depthly understand Linux and I love it. And sometimes that has been a struggle for me, trying to track down which module is loaded, what's going on, what firewall rule, have you got something that's automatically protecting things, processes getting locked, and you have to actually figure out what's going on. Network engineers don't do this very well. They also don't understand Linux. They also have never really had to do scripting or programming, whether it be Bash, Perl, PHP command line, or many other things, like especially these days Python, Ruby, and so forth. They've never really done programming. It's not part of their mentality. In fact, even the operating system and the command lines and the configs themselves don't really lean themselves to variabilization and things like that. So, but while I say this is the problem, it's actually the network engineer's problem. The entire world is going through an orchestration automation phase. This is the future. This is the way. There is no choice. Software-defined networking, same. Open networking, the disaggregation, Linux, it's all going the same way. If you're a network engineer today and you do not, firstly, know multiple platforms, Cisco, Juniper, others, and Linux, then you're probably heading down a slippery slope to oblivion if you haven't got plans to do it very soon. Then there's the next step. Automation, orchestration. You need to be understanding Puppet, Ansible, Chef, all those type of things that they're only recent, like a couple of years, but deployment and auto deployment of servers has been around for a long time. BootP and a whole bunch of other things automatically boot up, get your config. This just makes the orchestration a lot easier. The whole language is written around deploying servers. Now, Cumulus has brought that to the switching world, which means you can spin up a bare metal box, load an operating system, or have it already loaded, and it picks up its config from the net and configures itself on the fly without logging into it, without typing one command line. jumps on, orchestrates itself, does what it needs to. That's the power of Linux. Linux is going to be powering everything. Now, I do hear that Cumulus is trying to figure out how to make that path a bit easier. It is a struggle path. Because you might say, Skeeper, what about all the Linux engineers? Not that simple. Not that simple at all. Because while the network engineers don't understand Linux, Linux engineers, very rarely, probably the same rate, 95% of them, are not good at networking. I don't mean just adding a VLAN or a static route. I do mean Q&Q, trunking, VXLANs, BGP, ISIS, routing protocols, spanning tree, and everything else. It is probably actually easier for a network engineer to learn Linux and the new way of doing these things, new way of doing things, than it is for a Linux engineer to learn the entire complex world of networking. But if he can do that, he's actually got to, and then there's the next layer, orchestration. So just because he can learn Linux, now he's got to learn programming languages and the mentality that comes with that, and also managing platforms like this. Linux guy has to learn networking, but once he knows it, he can also orchestrate the hell out of it. So we've got two sides of the world at the moment, all coming together. I'm a Cisco, Juniper, multi-professional level certified engineer. I've been working with this for so long. I've been a Red Hat certified engineer. I'm one of the top level Cisco, Juniper, top level Linux, and I struggled when I started because I actually only ever used Linux for building servers. I never really thought about doing this. The customers we worked for, I liked enterprise grade solutions. I like building really stable stuff. I had a rule: never use companies that weren't multi-billion-dollar companies with certification, with structure, with support that you could do. I always liked Red Hat and not Debian. Why? Because Debian there's no ecosystem support. Red Hat, you can phone them even in Australia and in a couple of hours have a dozen Red Hat certified engineers turning up to help you. So with that logic, I'd always support anybody that had an enterprise grade version of Linux. Now I've got Cumulus. They've taken Debian and they've done it to it, right? So you can now, get a lot of you can get certification, get ecosystem. Sure, it's growing, but there's now $1 billion company behind it, and it's great. Cumulus has been very good to us. We've watching their transition from version 2 of their operating system to version 3, the new features. It's absolutely brilliant. They are aware of the complexity, as I was going to say about Linux. They are trying to put some features in that might make it easier or obfuscate the Linux kernel. I think that's a mistake. I think everybody needs to get into Linux, but I do acknowledge that it is a serious impediment to maybe the older crew and things like that. The younger crew coming through probably already know it anyway. So Cumulus networks, absolutely amazing. If you know Linux, if you're a Linux engineer, learn network engineering. If you're a network engineer, learn Linux. Debian flavor is where Cumulus is at. Some of the others could be where CentOS is at, or Red Hat, that type of platform. They're all going to be awesome. Once you learn one, it's not that hard to learn the other. Linux is king. Now, the price of these guys and the fact that all they do is sell software, you pay a few $1,000s, you get your software perpetually with a little bit of maintenance ongoing, and you can take that and stick it on that switch, another switch, a virtual switch. They've also got the Cumulus Networks VX. Go download it. It's free. It's absolutely free to run in the lab on VMware and a bunch of other things. Thank you, Cumulus, for your VX platform. It's made our life really, really easy in a consistent environment, right? But that's what these guys do. They have to innovate. People are going to try and copy them. They're going to make up their own versions of Linux. I know that Dell has got their own coming. I think HP have got their own coming. I think even FBOSS, I think even Facebook has its own version of Linux. In fact, Facebook's got their own switch as well. But Cumulus, I'm very happy with them. One of the things that sold me is the biggest cloud provider in the world. Starts with maybe A, I'm not sure. Has been running thousands upon thousands upon thousands of their switches for a few years now. Apple Siri, and some of their data sets run on Cumulus. You don't know what hardware, but it runs on Cumulus, and it doesn't necessarily make a difference. So if you adopt the Cumulus environment, it means you can use whatever switch vendor, whoever's got the best deal of the day, Dell, HP, Mellanox, Acton, Russian suppliers, Taiwanese suppliers, anyone who's got anything. If you settle on that, if you like a particular hardware vendor, you've got a choice of operating systems. But with Cumulus, you cannot go wrong. The Linux world is still strong, and it's massive. We're going into the new Docker, CoreOS, that kind of area. Still Linux everywhere. Even my little Samsung watch is powered by Linux. Even the new Tizen operating systems, everything is an underlying Linux. It is the king for now. You should use it, because I believe we're going down a path. While we're in open networking now, I believe that we're going to have open wireless coming, open firewalls coming, open storage. These will be Linux implementations that will liaise with those kinds of hardware. And IoT platforms all sitting based on Linux, the temperature sensors, the devices you talk to, the things that control your house. Imagine running Linux on a little tiny camera. They already do. But imagine it being able to get to the platform. Now, one of the curious things, the last thing I really want to mention about Linux and on these box. Previously, as a network engineer, I used to have to monitor these by SNMP. I'd have a Linux box somewhere, and it'd poll it, and it'd tell me if the port's up, port's down, speed, stats, things like that. Do an SNMP trap, and it would tell me when something's wrong. Now, remember what I said? This is a Linux box. It's a server. It's really a server. I can run Nagios, Zabbix on it. Sure, they don't have great hard drives. Maybe not a massive amount of RAM. That's very certainly a USP for some of the switch vendors out there. And I get to talk directly to the hardware. I can see at the watchdog level, at the proc level, all the way deep down, and I can monitor things that I've never been able to maybe even see before, and in new ways. And I can code it in whatever language I want to code it. That'll make it faster. I can write my own C programs and my own daemons. I can run routing protocols. I can do whatever I need to. In operations, orchestration, there is almost unlimited, the imagination of what you're going to be able to do with Cumulus, especially on one of these platforms. It's been very, very optimized. They're absolutely beautiful, and I can't speak highly enough for Cumulus. There's no products I can touch like these guys for Cumulus. It's software, and I believe it's actually going to be the next generation of operating systems. And Intelligo Networks have made a commitment. Every one of our engineers, over 20 engineers, are committed to this. In Asia, we're going to be starting doing Cumulus training soon. My CTO, Aftab, is one of the first certified Cumulus engineers in the world. We've been making a commitment to them, and they made a commitment to us. In Australia, they set up a local office. They got some great engineers, and we can talk directly to the CTO and the CEOs, I believe, of Cumulus themselves. This is a small, nimble company. Sure, they will get bigger over time, but they've been great to deal with. If you're an enterprise, if you're in a service provider, I can't strongly recommend enough that you seriously up your Linux skills, because everything else that's coming, software-defined networks or software-defined anything, is going to be sitting on top of Linux, and having Linux skills, orchestration, programming skills, and the underlying networking awesomeness, that is the future. And if you're an engineer and you're watching this, if you are not thinking about this now, I think we're calling it the net DevOps revolution, then you'll be out of job in a few years. You'll be that COBOL programmer sitting in the corner, occasionally doing work on traffic lights. And software-defined traffic lights will probably put you out of a job too. Okay, guys, Steve Stevens, professing his absolute love for Cumulus Network. Again, #TurtleLove. Love these guys. Love working with them. We've made a massive commitment. We are Cisco, Juniper, Arista, and Cumulus Linux engineers. We're Elastic engineers, and we want to work with you. One of the best advantages for working with the Intelligo is we know everything, mostly, that we need to know about most of these vendors, that we can make these babies work together. We love working. We love the interoperability. We love making these things dance and sing together and create very, very creative solutions. Peace out. Later.